Victor Ashcombe snatched the letter from his coat pocket and held it up in the middle of Caldwell's main street, reading aloud so every person within 30 feet could hear exactly what he wanted them to hear. "Says right here," he announced, loud enough to turn heads from the general store to the barbershop. "Garrett Boone ordered himself a bride and got his grandmother instead." The laughter that followed wasn't kind. It rolled down the street like a wave, knocking over everything decent in its path, and Victor stood at the center of it, grinning like a man who'd just won something. The stagecoach had barely stopped. The woman hadn't even set her bag down yet. And already, the whole town had decided she wasn't worth keeping. If this story already has your attention, you're exactly where you need to be. Subscribe to this channel and follow this story all the way to the end, because what happens next will surprise you. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me the city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now, let's get into it. The stagecoach from Cheyenne arrived at 2:30 on a Thursday, 20 minutes behind schedule, because one of the wheel brakes had stuck somewhere outside of Rollins, and the driver had lost 15 minutes arguing with it in the heat. Garrett Boone was already waiting when it pulled in. He'd been waiting for the better part of an hour, standing near the post at the edge of the platform, with his hat in his hands, turning the brim slowly with both thumbs the way a man does when he's nervous and trying not to show it. He was 41 years old, tall enough that the afternoon sun caught the silver threading into his dark hair, and he had the kind of face that had been weathered into something honest rather than something handsome. There were lines at the corners of his eyes that hadn't been there 2 years ago. The drought had put them there, and the debt had deepened them. He wasn't thinking about any of that when the coach door opened. He was thinking about the letter the Hartwell Matrimonial Agency had sent him 6 weeks prior, the one that described a woman named Clara Henning, 34 years old, experienced in domestic management, described as capable and willing to adapt to frontier conditions. He'd read that letter 4 times. He'd written back within the week. He wasn't a romantic man, hadn't been since his first wife passed, going on 9 years now, but the agency had offered something he needed more than romance: a partner. Someone who understood that a ranch wasn't a hobby, that cattle didn't wait for anyone to finish grieving, and that 2 years of bad rain and worse decisions had left Broken Pine Ranch one bad auction away from becoming someone else's property. The first passenger off the coach was a young man with a drummer's case and ink-stained fingers. The second was a woman. Garrett's hands went still on his hat brim. She wasn't 34, she wasn't anywhere near 34. The woman who stepped down from the coach with one hand on the doorframe and one hand gripping a brown leather travel bag was somewhere past 50, maybe closer to 60, with silver-streaked hair pinned back under a practical traveling hat and the kind of posture that belonged to someone who'd spent decades keeping their spine straight in spite of everything trying to bend it. Her hands, when they reached for the step railing, were not the soft hands of a woman sheltered from hard work. They were weathered hands. Capable hands. Hands that had done things. She looked at the platform, then she looked at the town, and then her eyes found Garrett standing there with his mouth slightly open and his hat motionless in his fists, and she walked directly toward him without hesitation. "You're Garrett Boone," she said. It wasn't a question. He cleared his throat. "Yes, ma'am." Margaret Holloway. She extended her hand and he shook it, mostly out of reflex. Her grip was firm and brief. "I believe the agency communicated my interest in the position." He stopped, started again. "Miss Holloway, I think there may have been a misunderstanding." "Mrs.," she said. "I'm a widow." "And there wasn't a misunderstanding. I applied, I was approved, and I came. If you have concerns, I'd prefer to discuss them somewhere less public." That was when Victor Ashcombe arrived. Garrett hadn't seen him coming. He rarely did. Victor had a talent for appearing at the exact moment his presence would do the most damage, materializing out of the spaces between conversations like something that had been waiting there all along. He was 53, broad-shouldered, dressed in a jacket that cost more than most men in Caldwell earned in 2 months, and he had the practiced ease of a man who'd spent his whole life in rooms where he was the most important person present. He owned 4,000 acres east of town, controlled 2 of the 3 local cattle buyers, and had been watching Broken Pine Ranch the way a hawk watches a field mouse, patient, certain, unhurried. He took one look at Margaret Holloway, and then he did what Garrett had been dreading since she stepped off the coach. He started laughing, not quietly, not under his breath. Victor Ashcombe pulled the envelope from his coat, the envelope that turned out to be a forwarded copy of Garrett's original application to the Hartwell Agency, which Garrett would later learn Victor had obtained through a contact at the county clerk's office, and he read from it out loud in the middle of the street with the kind of theatrical confidence that comes from never once being punished for cruelty. The laughter spread the way laughter always does when someone powerful is leading it. It picked up men from the barbershop steps, women pausing outside the dry goods store, a group of ranch hands who'd come in to collect supplies and now found something better to entertain them. Within 60 seconds, there were 24 people watching, and most of them were smiling in that uncomfortable way that people smile when they don't want to be the one not laughing. Margaret Holloway stood in the center of all of it and did not move. Garrett watched her face, searching for something. Embarrassment, anger, the particular wounded expression he'd braced himself to see, and he found none of those things. She was watching Victor with an expression closer to study than reaction, her eyes moving over him the way you'd assess a piece of machinery you were thinking about purchasing. Calm, interested, not bothered, Victor noticed. It irritated him more than tears would have. "Ma'am," he said, dropping the performance for something more cutting, walking toward her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'll be honest with you, because I'm a man who values directness. What Garrett needed when he placed that advertisement was a young woman. Capable hands, sure, but young ones, someone with energy, someone—" He paused, letting the word land softly before it hit hard. "Useful." "I heard you the first time," Margaret said. "I'm offering you a kindness. The stagecoach returns to Cheyenne day after tomorrow." He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a folded set of bills with the smooth motion of a man who'd rehearsed the gesture. "I'll pay your return fare myself. You'll be comfortable. No shame in it." The crowd had gone quiet in that specific way. Crowds go quiet when they're watching something they expect to turn into a spectacle. Margaret looked at the money. She looked at Victor's face. Then she bent down, picked up her travel bag from where she'd set it on the platform, and turned toward the street leading out of town. "I came to build a future," she said, "not run from one." She walked toward the ranch road, not the stagecoach depot, and she didn't look back. There was a moment, 3, maybe 4 seconds, where nobody said anything. Then Victor laughed again, but it was a shorter laugh this time, and it had a hollow place in the middle of it that hadn't been there before. Garrett looked at the retreating figure of Margaret Holloway carrying her bag toward the road to Broken Pine, and then he looked at Victor Ashcombe, holding out a fistful of money to a woman who'd already left, and something in his chest that had been wound tight for 2 years shifted slightly in its housing. He put his hat on. "Victor," he said. Victor turned. "Don't come to my property." He walked after Margaret, bobbed. They didn't talk much on the ride back to the ranch. The buckboard was narrow and the road was rutted from the dry summer, and Garrett spent most of it trying to figure out what he was supposed to say to a woman who'd just been publicly humiliated in the middle of a town that wasn't hers and had responded by picking up her bag and walking toward his problems instead of away from them. Margaret spent most of it looking at the land. Not out of politeness or distraction. She was actually looking at it, studying the grass, the fence lines, the way the creek bed had dried back from its banks, the condition of the cattle he kept in the east pasture visible from the road. Her eyes moved over it the way someone reads a page, left to right, taking things in, noting them. She had a small leather notebook on her knee that she'd pulled from her bag without comment, and twice she opened it and wrote something in a hand too small for him to read at that distance. "How long has the creek been running that low?" she asked, the first time she'd spoken since they left town. Garrett glanced at the dry bank. 2 summers. "How many head do you run?" 312 at the last count. Lost about 40 this year. She wrote something else. "What's your rotation on the east pasture?" He didn't answer right away. She looked up from the notebook. "You don't rotate. It's always—" He stopped. "No, not in recent years." Margaret made a sound that wasn't agreement or disagreement, just acknowledgement. She looked back at the pasture and wrote something else, And Garrett had the strange and unsettling experience of being assessed by a woman on the way to his own ranch, as if he were the property under evaluation rather than the person conducting it. "I want to be straight with you," he said finally, when the gate to Broken Pine came into view. "I don't know what the agency told you about what I was looking for." "I know what you were looking for," she said. "Then you understand why you're uncomfortable." She nodded, not unkindly. "Yes, you wanted someone young enough to be a wife in the full sense of the word. Someone who might give you children, or at least the possibility of them. Someone who'd grow into the ranch rather than arrive already knowing more about it than you expected." She closed the notebook. "I'm not that person." Garrett said nothing. "But I'm here," she continued, "and you've already brought me this far, so I'll make you a proposition. Give me 2 weeks. Let me look at what you have, and I'll tell you honestly what I see and what I think can be done. If at the end of 2 weeks you want me gone, I'll go without complaint and without any claim on this ranch or your time. But give me 2 weeks before you decide." He pulled the buckboard to a stop inside the gate. "2 weeks," he said. 2 weeks. He climbed down and helped her with her bag, and she followed him across the yard to the house, and somewhere behind them the gate swung shut in the dry Wyoming wind. Hugged. The ranch hands took one look at Margaret Holloway and didn't bother hiding what they thought. There were 3 of them full-time. A 26-year-old named Dex, who'd been with Garrett for 4 years and had opinions about everything. A quiet man named Rafe in his mid-30s who mostly kept to himself, but wasn't above a smirk when Dex was driving one. And a 17-year-old they all called Coop, whose real name was something like Theodore, but who'd earned the nickname by spending his first week building a chicken coop so lopsided that it became a permanent reference point for anything done badly. Dex was the one who voiced it. "She's going to be the one running things?" he asked, and he didn't ask it quietly. Garrett said, "She's a guest for the time being. Show some manners." "I'm not saying it's wrong," Dex said, walking alongside Garrett toward the barn with his voice adjusted to something that was technically lower but in no way private. "I'm just asking, because she's got to be, 60? "She's here," Garrett said. "That's all you need to know." Margaret, walking 15 feet behind them, heard every word. She didn't say anything about it. What she did, starting the next morning before 6 o'clock, was begin. Garrett came down to find her already at the kitchen table with her notebook and a mug of coffee she'd made herself, studying what turned out to be his breeding records. He had a box of them, not well organized, stuffed with loose papers and receipts going back 6 years, and she'd apparently found it in the office without asking and was working through it with a pencil, making marks in the margins. He stopped in the doorway. "Those are your herd records, yes. From the look of them, you haven't tracked lineage consistently in about 3 years, and you've been breeding from the same bulls too long. You've got inbreeding starting to show in the spring calves." She looked up. "How many calves did you lose this spring?" 11. 12 if you count the one Dex didn't record. She tapped the page. "It's here in the feed tally. Extra loss in the second pen in April." Garrett stood in his own kitchen at 6 in the morning, feeling the particular discomfort of being corrected about something on his own property by someone he'd known for 11 hours. "You want coffee?" she asked. "I made enough." He poured himself a cup and sat down across from her, and that became, without either of them calling it anything, the first of what would turn into a daily ritual. The early morning, the kitchen table, the records spread between them, Margaret talking, and Garrett listening, and sometimes arguing, and Margaret never once raising her voice, but also never once backing down. The first real fight happened on day 3. Margaret had asked to walk the south pasture, and Garrett had taken her, and she'd bent down twice in the first 20 minutes to pull up handfuls of grass that she examined, smelled, and then dropped with an expression of quiet concern. "You're mineral deficient," she said. "Probably selenium, maybe copper. That's why you're losing animals. It's not disease, it's the land." "I've had the vet out twice this year," Garrett said. "What did he check for?" "Disease? Parasites." "Did he do soil testing?" Garrett didn't answer. "You need to amend this pasture," Margaret said, "and you need to pull the herd off it for at least 6 weeks while you do." "I don't have 6 weeks. Auction's in 9. "Then you need to start now." I don't have the money for soil amendments right now. Every dollar I have is spoken for until after the auction. Margaret looked at him, not impatiently. She didn't have the face of a woman who wasted energy on impatience, but steadily. What are your cattle going to sell for if they go to auction already weakened? He knew the answer. He'd known it before she asked. Not enough, he said. Then you have a choice between spending money you're reluctant to spend now or losing money you're depending on later. She looked back at the pasture. I know which one I'd choose, but it's your ranch. She walked back toward the house without waiting for him to respond, and Garrett stood in the south pasture with the dead grass in his hand and the particular feeling of a man who has just been given the right answer to a question he'd been asking himself for months, and is furious about it. He ordered the soil amendments that afternoon. On day 5, Victor Ashcomb's man came. Not Victor himself. Victor was too careful for that. He sent a man named Pruitt, who drove a nice wagon and had a nice hat, and came to the front door with a nice smile and a message that wasn't nice at all. Mr. Ashcombe wanted me to let you know, Pruitt said to Garrett, standing on the porch with his hat in his hands, in the way of a man performing deference without actually feeling it, that he's heard some concerns around town about the condition of your herd. He's worried, as a neighbor, you understand, that if you go to the auction with sick cattle, it could reflect poorly on the whole county's reputation. He thought you might want to know that he's willing to purchase the herd privately before the auction at a price that wouldn't— Get off my property, Garrett said. Pruitt blinked. Mr. Boone, I'm not going to say it twice. Pruitt left. From the kitchen window, Margaret had watched the entire exchange. When Garrett came back inside, she was already at the table, and she set down her coffee and looked at him. He's going to try to undercut you at the auction, she said. I know. He'll spread word about sick cattle, whether your cattle are sick or not. I know that too. Then we need documentation, she said. Everything we've done, everything we're doing, every improvement, it needs to be written down and independently verified. I want the vet out here not to treat disease but to certify health. I want every soil amendment recorded, every feed change, every breeding decision. Garrett studied her. You've dealt with someone like him before? Margaret was quiet for a moment. My husband's ranch in Colorado. Different man, same playbook. She picked up her coffee. We won that time too. It was the first personal thing she'd said. Garrett didn't push it. He just nodded and reached for his own cup, and they sat there in the kitchen while the wind moved outside, and the ranch around them kept its silence, and neither of them said anything else, but the silence had a different quality to it than it had the day before. By the end of the first week, Dex had stopped rolling his eyes, not because he'd had any kind of change of heart. Dex was not the kind of man who had those, but because Margaret had done something he hadn't expected. She'd made his job easier. Not by doing it for him, but by looking at what he was doing and pointing out, without condescension, the 3 places where he was working twice as hard as he needed to. The hay storage, for one. He'd been stacking it the way he'd always stacked it, and Margaret had watched him for half an hour one morning and then suggested a different arrangement that cut the retrieval time by roughly a third, and also reduced the moisture exposure that was costing them feed to mold every winter. Dex hadn't thanked her, but the next day he'd reorganized the storage, and he'd done it her way. Rafe was the easiest of the 3. He watched Margaret for the first 4 days without comment, and then on the 5th day had come to her and asked very quietly if she could show him what she'd been doing with the breeding records, because he'd been trying to understand why the spring calves were smaller than they used to be, and nobody had been able to tell him. She'd spent 2 hours with him at the table. Coop was 17 and thought everything was either the best thing he'd ever seen or the worst, and Margaret became very quickly the best thing. He followed her around the property on her inspection walks with the unabashed enthusiasm of a puppy. Asking questions she answered seriously and completely, and twice she'd stopped whatever she was doing to show him something in the soil or the grass or the cattle behavior that you only notice if you've been looking for 30 years. How do you know all this? He asked her on day 6, sitting on the fence rail while she examined a calf she'd been monitoring for 3 days. Time, she said. Mostly time. But you had to learn it somewhere. I did. My husband's ranch, and before that my father's. And before that, she glanced at him. You learn by watching. You watch long enough, the land tells you what it needs. Coop thought about that. Mr. Boone never taught us to watch. Mr. Boone was taught to work, she said, not unkindly. There's a difference. Coop sat with that for a while. Then, Mrs. Holloway? Yes. That man in town, Mr. Ashcombe, he's going to try to ruin the auction, isn't he? Margaret looked up from the calf. She looked at the 17-year-old sitting on the fence rail with dirt on his boots and genuine worry on his face, and she said, Yes, he's going to try. Are we going to let him? The word surprised her. She felt it. No, she said. We're not. Coop nodded, like that settled it, and he jumped down from the fence to help her with the calf, and in the dust and the dry Wyoming air, with 9 weeks until the auction and Victor Ashcombe's machinery already in motion, Broken Pine Ranch began, quietly and without ceremony, to fight back. By the end of the second week, the south pasture had been amended and the herd rotated off it. The breeding records were reorganized and cross-referenced in a system Margaret had built from scratch. The irrigation channels had been cleared of the sediment that had been silting them up for 2 seasons, work that took Dex and Rafe 4 solid days and that Margaret had supervised from start to finish, down in the muck alongside them more than once when a second pair of hands was needed. The feed program had been adjusted. The calves that had been losing weight were gaining. Garrett had stopped counting down her 2 weeks. He wasn't entirely sure when he'd stopped. Somewhere around day 9 or 10, the accounting of it had dropped out of his thinking, and he'd simply started waking up and going down to the kitchen where the coffee was already made, and the records were already spread on the table and the day's work was already outlined in Margaret Holloway's small, precise handwriting, and he'd stopped experiencing that as an imposition and started experiencing it as something else, something he didn't have a clean word for yet. On the evening of the 14th day, he came into the kitchen late, after a fence repair that had taken longer than expected, and found her at the table with the lamp lit and her notebook in front of her and something in her posture that was different from the usual careful straightness. Something that suggested tiredness. Not the kind you complain about, the kind you carry. He sat down across from her. 2 weeks, he said. She looked up. You said 2 weeks. I did, she said. I don't want you to go, Garrett said. It came out more direct than he'd planned, and he didn't try to walk it back. The ranch is already different than it was. You know it and I know it. Whatever the arrangement ends up being, he stopped. I just want to be honest with you the way you've been honest with me. I want you to stay. Margaret looked at him for a long moment, not searching exactly, more like testing the weight of what he'd said, checking it for solidity. The auction is in 7 weeks, she said. I know. Victor Ashcombe is going to make it harder than you expect. I know that too. And you still want me here? Yes. She picked up her pen. She looked down at the notebook. And then she said quietly, All right. Outside, the Wyoming dark had settled over Broken Pine Ranch, over the south pasture just starting to come back, over the reorganized hay storage, over the calves gaining weight in the pen, over the breeding records finally telling a coherent story. The wind moved the dry grass and rattled the gatepost, and somewhere in the barn, one of the horses shifted and stamped, and Margaret Holloway turned a page in her notebook and began writing the next day's work. She had 7 weeks. She intended to use every one of them. The 7th week started the way the 6th had ended, with work that didn't stop because the sun went down and started again before it came fully back up. Margaret had reorganized her days into a rhythm that the ranch hands had stopped questioning somewhere around week 3. She was up at 5:15, coffee made by 5:30, records reviewed before Garrett came down at 6. By the time Dex and Rafe arrived at the barn, she'd already done a walking inspection of the closest pens and had her notes ready. It wasn't performance. It wasn't proving anything. It was simply how she'd operated for the better part of 4 decades, and she saw no reason to change it because she was in Wyoming instead of Colorado. What she hadn't expected was how much the land would talk to her. Not in any mystical sense. Margaret Holloway was not a mystical woman. But every piece of land has a logic to it, a pattern of what it wants and what it resists, and she'd learned a long time ago that the fastest way to understand a ranch was to stop telling it what you needed and start paying attention to what it was already saying. Broken Pine had been saying the same things for probably 3 years, and nobody had been listening. The south pasture was the loudest. She'd caught it on the ride in, the color of the grass, the way it lay flat instead of holding itself up, the particular dull quality of it that meant the soil underneath was exhausted rather than just dry. Drought had made everything look bad, but drought alone didn't explain the cattle losses. Animals on drought-stressed land get thin. They don't get weak in the specific way Garrett's herd was weak. The brittle hooves, the rough coats, the calves that came small and stayed small. That kind of weakness was nutritional, mineral, the kind that builds up over years of land that's been asked to give more than it's been given back. She'd been right about the selenium. The soil test confirmed it 10 days in, selenium deficiency throughout the south pasture, borderline copper levels in the east, and a pH problem in the field closest to the creek that had been quietly reducing the nutrient uptake for probably 2 full growing seasons. It wasn't one thing. It was never one thing. It was 3 years of small decisions that each seemed reasonable in isolation, adding up to a situation that looked, from the outside, like bad luck. Garrett had stood over those soil results with his jaw set in the way she'd come to recognize as the expression he wore when reality was confirming something he'd been hoping wasn't true. The vet said it was probably disease, he said. The vet was looking for disease, Margaret said. You find what you look for. He'd been quiet for a moment. How long to fix it? The pasture? 6 months to a year before it's fully productive again. But the herd will respond to the mineral supplementation faster. 4 to 6 weeks, you should see visible improvement. She tapped the results page. The good news is your cattle aren't sick. They're malnourished, and that's fixable. The auction's in 7 weeks. I know. Will they be ready? She'd looked at him straight. They'll be better than they've been in 2 years. Whether that's ready enough depends on what kind of fight Victor picks. That had been the pivot point. Because the moment she said Victor's name, both of them felt the weight of what was actually at stake shift from the land problem into something sharper and more immediate. Victor Ashcombe had not been idle. The rumors started in the 3rd week and gathered speed the way rumors do in small places. Not through any single act, but through accumulation. A word here, a suggestion there. The kind of thing that's impossible to trace back to its source because by the time you hear it, it's already been through 6 people and none of them will claim to have started it. The story making its way through Caldwell and the surrounding ranches was simple and effective. Garrett Boone's herd was sick. Not drought-thin sick, not malnourished sick, sick. The kind of sick that spreads. The kind of sick that could jump fence lines and cost your neighbors a season's worth of work. Nobody was saying it loudly. Nobody was putting their name to it. But it was there, spreading the way smoke spreads, getting into everything. Garrett heard it first from the feed merchant, who mentioned it apologetically while they were settling an account. I'm not saying I believe it, the man said, clearly uncomfortable. I'm just letting you know what's going around. Garrett came home that evening quieter than usual. Margaret noticed before he said anything. She'd gotten good at reading the difference between tired and troubled. And this was troubled. She put coffee in front of him and sat down and waited. He told her. All of it, including the parts that were clearly embellished. Someone had apparently added a version where 3 of his cattle had died in the past month and he'd been hiding it. Margaret listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, How many buyers attend the Caldwell auction? Usually 12, 15 independent, plus the 2 major operations that Ashcombe. He stopped. That he influences. So if he poisons the independent buyers before the auction, what does he have left? A herd nobody wants to buy. And then he steps in with a private offer. At whatever price he decides to offer, Margaret nodded slowly. We need an inspection. I was going to call the vet. Not the vet, she said. Not just the vet. We need someone the buyers will trust. Someone with no connection to this county, no relationship with Ashcombe, no reason to be anything but impartial. She picked up her coffee. Do you know anyone at the State Livestock Board? Garrett thought. There's a man, Harold Fitch. He did the county inspection 2 years ago, seemed straight. Can you reach him? I can try. Try tomorrow, she said. And in the meantime, she slid a piece of paper across the table that she'd apparently already prepared, which meant she'd been thinking about this before he came home, which meant she'd heard something herself or had simply calculated that it was coming. I want to start a documentation file. Every treatment we've done, every soil amendment, every feed change, every weight record. I want it dated and witnessed where we can manage it. If someone's going to make claims about this herd, I want a paper record that tells a completely different story. Garrett looked at the paper, at the neat columns she'd already drawn up, at the fact that she'd had it ready. You knew this was coming, he said. I know men like Victor Ashcombe, she said simply. When the ranch starts improving, he'll get anxious. Anxious men make moves. She folded her hands on the table. We just need to be further ahead than he expects. Dex found out about the rumors through a girl he was seeing in town, who'd heard it from her employer, who'd heard it from someone at the feed store. And he came back to the ranch 2 days later with the particular expression of a man who's been defending something and wants credit for it. I told her it wasn't true, he said to Garrett in the yard in the early afternoon. I told her our herd was fine. It is fine, Garrett said. I know that. But Dex pushed his hat back. People are saying things. Doris at the dry goods told Martha that 3 buyers already said they weren't coming to the auction on account of it. Garrett said nothing. He didn't have anything to say that would make it better. Dex looked toward the barn, where through the open doors you could see Margaret working with Rafe on the breeding documentation, both of them at the work table, Margaret writing, Rafe sorting papers, talking in the quiet, focused way of 2 people doing something that matters. She already know? Yes. She got a plan? Garrett almost smiled. She always has a plan. Dex watched her for another moment. I was wrong about her, he said. It cost him something to say it. You could see the price in how briefly he said it, how he immediately looked away afterward. Early on. I was wrong. Tell her that, Garrett said, not me. Dex looked like he'd rather do almost anything else, but he nodded and walked toward the barn, and Garrett didn't follow because some things need to happen without an audience. He never found out exactly what Dex said to Margaret in there, or what she said back. What he knew was that when they came out 20 minutes later, Dex was carrying a new stack of papers and had the expression of a man who has been given more work to do and is genuinely glad about it. Harold Fitch from the State Livestock Board arrived on a Wednesday, driving a board-issue wagon and wearing the kind of no-nonsense expression that comes standard with government positions in rural territories. He was 60, angular, had clearly spent his career outdoors, and he shook Garrett's hand with the brief efficiency of a man who had 6 other ranches to see this month and wasn't inclined toward small talk. He was also, it became apparent within 10 minutes of his arrival, considerably more interested in Margaret than in Garrett. Not romantically, nothing like that. But he'd been introduced to her as the ranch's livestock manager, which was the title they'd agreed on without making a formal agreement about it. And when she'd begun walking him through the herd records, his demeanor had shifted from efficient impartiality into something closer to genuine attention. You said you ran your late husband's operation in Colorado, he said, pausing at a note in the breeding records she'd made about bull rotation. For 22 years, she said. What county? Garfield, he thought. Under the Consolidated Grazing Act? We filed under the original registration, predated the consolidation by about 8 years. He nodded, and something in his expression recalibrated. Whatever category he'd placed her in when they'd been introduced had just gotten larger. He spent 4 hours at Broken Pine Ranch. He examined the herd. He looked at the pastures, including the south pasture with its amendments still working their way into the soil. He reviewed the documentation file Margaret had been building, every treatment, every record, every weight measurement with its date. He asked questions and received answers, and the answers matched the records, and the records matched the animals. And by the time he was loading back into his wagon, he had the particular look of a man who's found what he expected to find, but is pleased by it anyway. Your herd is not sick, he said to Garrett, standing at the wagon. They're in recovery from mineral deficiency, which is documented, being treated, and showing visible improvement. I'll have my written certification to you within the week. Thank you, Garrett said. Fitch looked at Margaret. The documentation work is thorough, better than most operations I see. A pause. Better than some that have been running twice as long. Margaret said, Thank you, Mr. Fitch. He left. Garrett and Margaret stood in the yard watching the wagon go, and Garrett exhaled slowly. That's one problem handled, he said. One, she agreed. He'll find another angle. She was right. The delivery interference started in week 5. The first sign was the mineral supplement shipment that arrived 2 weeks late with no explanation from the supplier, a supplier Garrett had used for 6 years without incident. When he called on it, the supplier was apologetic and vague in equal measure, citing a paperwork issue he couldn't fully explain. Margaret had listened to Garrett's account of the conversation and then asked one question. "Has this supplier done business with Ashcombe?" Garrett had gone still. "I don't know," he said. "Find out." He found out. The supplier had a standing contract with the Ashcombe operation, had for years. Whether that explained the delayed shipment was impossible to prove. What it meant in practice was that the mineral supplementation program Margaret had built the herd's recovery around had a 2-week gap in it at the worst possible time, 5 weeks before the auction. She'd adapted. She'd found an alternative supplier 2 counties over, paid more for it, and had Rafe drive out to collect it personally rather than wait for delivery. The gap ended up being 10 days instead of 14, and Margaret had supplemented with what they had on hand in the interim, stretching it differently than she'd planned and working the feeding schedule in ways that Dex, watching her do it, described to Coop as like watching someone do arithmetic in their head while everybody else is still looking for a pencil. The second interference was worse. 4 weeks before the auction, word came through a neighboring rancher, a man named Aldous, who ran about 200 head east of Broken Pine and had no particular love for Victor Ashcombe, that 2 of the independent buyers who regularly attended the Caldwell auction had been approached privately with information suggesting that Broken Pine's cattle were carrying a bloodline defect that would affect the next generation's weight gain. Not disease, not malnourishment, a genetic claim. Subtle, hard to disprove quickly, exactly the kind of thing that would make a cautious buyer hold his bid. Garrett told Margaret about it over supper, and she set down her fork and was quiet for a long moment. "He's getting specific," she said. "He's making things up." "Yes, but specific things are harder to fight than vague things. Vague rumors." She picked up her fork again. "You can answer with a certification. Specific technical claims require specific technical answers." "So what do we do?" "We give them the answers before they have to ask." She started eating again, thinking while she did it, the way she thought about most things, through and around and into it, the same quality of attention she gave the land. "I'm going to write to every independent buyer who typically attends the Caldwell auction. Not to argue, not to deny anything, just to invite them to a private inspection at Broken Pine 2 weeks before the auction. Let them see the animals themselves. Let them review the state board certification. Let them ask whatever questions they have." Garrett looked at her. "That's aggressive. Yes. It puts us on the front foot instead of the back. Victor can spread whatever he likes about cattle that people haven't seen. It's harder to maintain those stories about cattle that buyers have walked past and examined themselves. What if some of them don't come? Some won't. But the ones who do will buy, and they'll bid honestly, and that's enough." She looked up from her plate. "It's not about getting every buyer. It's about getting enough of them." Garrett sat with that. The lamp between them threw warm light across the table, across the records stacked to one side, across Margaret's careful handwriting on the invitation draft she'd already started on a separate sheet of paper. "You wrote it before you told me," he said. She glanced at it. "I wrote the draft. It's your ranch. You decide if we send it." He reached over and picked up the draft and read it. It was direct and factual and had nothing defensive in it. No protesting, no over-explaining. It simply stated that Broken Pine Ranch would be hosting a livestock preview for interested buyers on a specific date and that the state board certification would be on hand, along with complete herd records. "Add something at the end," he said. "What?" "That the rancher looks forward to answering questions personally." He set it back down. "I want them to know I'm not hiding." Margaret picked up her pen and added the line. Her handwriting didn't change, same small, precise letters, same consistent pressure, but she read it back once after she'd written it, and he thought she looked slightly more satisfied than she had before. "Send it tomorrow," he said. 8 buyers responded. 6 said they'd come. Coop, when he heard, let out a sound that was somewhere between a cheer and a yelp, and Rafe allowed himself a slow smile that took up most of his face, and Dex said, "6 is enough," in the flat, authoritative tone of a man who has decided something and needs everyone to know he's decided it. Margaret spent the 2 weeks before the preview doing what she'd been doing since she arrived, only more so. She walked the herd daily. She adjusted the supplementation schedule twice based on what she was seeing. She had the pens cleaned and reorganized, not for appearances, but because clean pens meant healthier animals, and she wasn't interested in theater. What she was doing was making sure that when 6 buyers walked onto Broken Pine Ranch, every animal they looked at was the best version of what it could be given where it had started 7 weeks ago. The night before the preview, Garrett found her in the barn. She was with one of the older cows, a 7-year-old that had been borderline during the worst of the mineral deficiency and had taken longer to respond to the supplementation than Margaret had liked. She was crouched beside the animal, in the hay, one hand on the cow's side, not doing anything in particular, just being there. Garrett leaned on the stall door. "She doing all right?" "Better," Margaret said. "She'll do." He was quiet for a moment. The barn around them was the quiet of animals settled for the night, the particular peace of large creatures breathing, shifting, standing in their rest. "You nervous?" he asked. Margaret considered it honestly, the way she considered most things. "No," she said. "I've done the work. The work is what it is." She stood, brushing hay from her knee. "Are you?" "Some," he admitted. She looked at him. "The buyers are going to see what's here, Garrett. What's here is good. Not perfect." She gestured at the cow. "Not everything I'd want it to be, but good. And honest." She moved past him toward the barn door. "Honest is harder to argue with than you'd think." She left him there with the animals and the lamplight, and Garrett Boone stood in his own barn on the eve of the most important day his ranch had seen in 2 years, and felt, not for the first time since that stagecoach rolled in, that the person who had shown up was not what he'd expected and was exactly what he'd needed, and that those two things, as it turned out, were not as different as he'd once believed. The preview was tomorrow. The auction was in 2 weeks. And Victor Ashcombe, who had been very quiet for the past 10 days, was not the kind of man who stayed quiet for any good reason. The 6 buyers arrived on a Friday morning, spread across 2 hours, coming in wagons and on horseback from 3 different directions, the way people do when they've each made their own separate decision to show up, and none of them want to look like they coordinated it. Garrett met each one at the gate personally. He dressed for it, clean shirt, good boots, hat brushed, without overdoing it, because overdoing it would have looked like desperation, and desperation was the one thing he couldn't afford to show. He shook hands and made small talk about the roads and the weather and the price of feed, the universal language of men who work land for a living, and he walked each one toward the main pen where Margaret was already waiting. She was wearing what she always wore, practical clothes, sensible boots, her silver hair pinned back, and she had the documentation file under one arm and Harold Fitch's state board certification on top of it. And when the first buyer, a compact man named Reeves from 2 counties north, looked her over with the brief evaluating glance that men of his generation gave to women in professional contexts, she met his eyes and said, "Thank you for making the trip, Mr. Reeves. Let's start with the herd record so you understand what you're looking at before you look at it." Reeves blinked, then he nodded. Margaret opened the file and started talking, and within 4 minutes, Reeves had stopped looking at her like she was an unexpected variable and started looking at her like she was the most useful person in the yard. Garrett watched it happen with all 6 of them. It didn't happen at the same speed. Some of the buyers took longer than others to stop subtracting points for her age and gender and start adding them for her knowledge. But it happened with all of them, at some point during the morning, that shift in how they were listening to her, from polite to actual, from waiting for her to finish to wanting her to continue. She walked them through the herd systematically, not randomly. She had a sequence to it, the animals that showed the clearest recovery first, so the buyers could see what the supplementation program had accomplished, and then the ones that were still catching up, so they couldn't accuse her later of hiding anything. She named every problem that had existed when she arrived and what had been done about it. She showed them the soil results and the treatment records and the weight logs and the breeding documentation, and she answered every question directly and without decoration. At one point, a buyer named Halloran, older, skeptical, the kind of man who'd been fooled before and made sure everyone knew it, held up one of the weight records and said, How do I know these numbers are real? Margaret said, You don't, from the paper alone. But the animals are in front of you, and you're welcome to weigh any three of your choosing right now. We have a scale. Halloran looked at her for a moment. Then he picked three animals. They weighed them. The numbers matched the records within acceptable variance. Halloran handed the records back without comment, but he stayed for the rest of the morning and he asked more questions than anyone else, and Margaret answered all of them. By noon, 5 of the 6 had confirmed they'd be at the Caldwell auction. The 6th, a young buyer named Pershing, who'd come mostly out of curiosity and who Garrett suspected was still building his operation and not quite ready to make a move this size, shook hands on his way out and said he'd be back next year, and that was good enough. When the last wagon had left, Garrett and Margaret stood at the gate, and Dex and Rafe and Coop came out of the barn where they'd been pointedly doing other things all morning, and the 5 of them stood in the yard in the afternoon heat, and nobody said anything for a moment. Then Coop said, 5 out of 6. 5 is enough, Dex said, which was exactly what he'd said when the responses came in, and somehow it meant more this time. Margaret was already opening her notebook. Victor Ashcombe found out about the preview within 48 hours. Garrett expected that. What he didn't expect was how long Victor went quiet afterward. 5 days of nothing, no Pruitt at the gate, no rumors filtering back through town, no unusual activity that any of the neighboring ranchers reported. 5 days of silence from a man who'd been making noise for 7 weeks straight. It made Margaret more watchful, not less. He's not done, she said on the 3rd quiet day, not looking up from the irrigation records she was updating. He's recalculating. Maybe he figured out it wasn't going to work, Garrett said. She looked up then. Men like Victor don't figure that out. They find a different angle. She went back to the records. We need to be ready for something we haven't anticipated. What they hadn't anticipated arrived 9 days before the auction, and it came from a direction that surprised even Margaret. A man named Callum Webb showed up at the ranch on a Tuesday afternoon, riding alone on a good horse, and asked to speak to Garrett privately. He was in his mid-40s, weathered and quiet, with the look of someone who'd spent years working outdoor jobs and was currently uncomfortable about something specific. Garrett knew him slightly. Webb had worked for Victor Ashcombe as a ranch manager for close to 6 years, running the day-to-day operations of the Ashcombe spread while Victor focused on the business side. He'd left the Ashcombe operation about 8 months ago, and the story around town was that it had not been a friendly parting. Garrett brought him inside. Margaret was in the kitchen and made no move to leave, and Webb glanced at her once and then apparently decided she was staying regardless and directed his attention to Garrett. I heard what's been going on, Webb said. He was holding his hat in both hands and turning it slowly, almost exactly the way Garrett had held his own hat on the platform the day the stagecoach arrived, and Garrett noted the similarity. The rumors, the delivery trouble, the buyer interference. Word gets around, Garrett said. I know where it's coming from, Webb said, and I know more than that. He stopped turning the hat. When I was working for Ashcombe, I handled the correspondence for his land acquisitions. I know about the foreclosure scheme. The kitchen went very quiet. Margaret set down her pen. What scheme? Garrett said. It wasn't really a question. Webb laid it out. It took about 15 minutes, and it was worse than what Garrett had guessed. Victor hadn't just been opportunistically trying to acquire Broken Pine Ranch. He'd been systematically setting up its failure for close to 18 months. The delivery interference wasn't spontaneous. There were letters arranging it, sent through intermediaries to suppliers and buyers alike. The rumor campaign had a source, a man in Victor's employ whose only job, as far as Webb could tell, had been to visit saloons and feed stores and barbershops and mention things. The marriage contract interference was there too. Webb had personally seen correspondence between Victor and someone at the Hartwell agency, a letter suggesting that any bride sent to Garrett Boone be, as Victor had phrased it, unsuitable for the rigors of the position. At that, Margaret's expression didn't change, but her pen, which she'd picked back up without looking at it, went still. He tried to make sure the agency sent someone who couldn't help, Garrett said. Yes, Webb said, Webb. And instead they sent me, Margaret said quietly. Webb looked at her. He made the mistake of assuming the agency would cooperate with the spirit of his suggestion rather than just the letter of it. He said unsuitable. They sent a widow with 40 years of ranching experience. A pause. I think whoever handled your application at the agency either didn't understand what he was trying to do or decided to ignore it. Margaret said nothing. She was looking at the table, at her notebook, at the pen in her hand, and whatever she was thinking she kept to herself for the moment. But her jaw was set in a way Garrett hadn't seen before. Not anger exactly, something harder and more deliberate than anger. "Why are you telling us this?" Garrett asked Webb. Webb was quiet for a moment. "Because he owed me 6 months of wages when I left, and instead of paying them, he threatened to tell people I'd been falsifying his feed records, which I hadn't." He looked down at his hat. "I've been waiting for a situation where what I know is worth something. This looks like that situation." "Will you testify?" Margaret asked. Webb looked at her. "Testify to what? There's no court case." "Not yet," she said, "but the Caldwell auction is 9 days away, and what you've described is a coordinated scheme to defraud a ranchie, a rancher, and manipulate a livestock market. That's not just a neighbor being difficult. That's something a county official would want to know about." She folded her hands on the table. "And the independent buyers who are coming to that auction, men who value fair dealing, would want to know they've been manipulated as much as Garrett has." Webb thought about it. It took a while. He looked at his hat, looked at the table, looked at the wall. Then he said, "I've got letters. Copies I made before I left because I knew someday I might need them." "Can you get them here before the auction?" Margaret asked. "I can have them here by Thursday." "Thursday," she said. "Good." She wrote the day in her notebook. The letters arrived Thursday as promised, a thick envelope that Webb delivered personally, saying almost nothing when he handed it over, just nodding once and leaving. Margaret and Garrett spent that evening at the kitchen table going through them, Garrett reading and Margaret cataloging, building a second documentation file that sat beside the first one and told a completely different story than the one Victor had been trying to construct for 18 months. It was late when they finished. The lamp had burned low, and Garrett's coffee had gone cold unnoticed, and outside the Wyoming dark had settled into the kind of deep quiet that only exists in places far enough from towns that you can hear the absence of noise. "This is enough," Margaret said, setting the last letter down. "Enough to do what with? Enough to take to the county land office tomorrow morning, and enough to share with the buyers before the auction." She looked at him. "I want to write to Reeves tonight. He's the senior buyer of the group, and if he goes in knowing what's in these letters, he'll make sure the others do too." Garrett looked at the pile of letters, at 18 months of Victor Ashcomb's careful, patient maneuvering laid out in black ink on paper, at the document that proved someone had tried, deliberately and specifically, to make sure Broken Pine Ranch failed and that the man it was meant to help never got the kind of help that might actually save it. "He tried to control who the agency sent," Garrett said. "Not for the first time, but quietly, the way you say something when it's still settling into what it means." "Yes. Because he knew if I got someone capable, someone who actually knew ranching, the plan wouldn't work," Margaret said. "A capable partner would have found the same problems I found, would have documented the same things, would have been exactly as inconvenient to him as I've apparently been." She picked up her pen. "He planned for a young woman who'd be overwhelmed. He didn't plan for someone who'd seen his type before." Garrett was quiet for a moment. "How many times have you seen his type?" She thought about it honestly. 3. Once in Colorado when my husband was alive, once after he passed and someone tried to buy the ranch, for a fraction of what it was worth, and once in between when a land speculator tried to tie up our water rights through a legal claim that turned out to be fraudulent." She paused. "We won all 3 times. What made the difference?" "Documentation," she said, "and not panicking." She started writing the letter to Reeves, and not letting anyone tell you what something is worth when you know what it's worth yourself. The county land office took the letter seriously, in the way that offices take things seriously when the evidence is clear and the person presenting it is calm and organized, meaning they opened a file, they asked questions, they assigned someone to look into it, and they gave no indication of when or whether anything would actually happen before the auction. Margaret had expected that. She told Garrett on the way there that the official process would move at its own speed regardless of their timeline. and that the value of filing wasn't immediate action, but rather the existence of a record that Victor couldn't ignore or erase. Once it's filed, she said in the wagon on the way back, it changes his calculation. He knows there's a file. He knows that anything he does at the auction now has an official context around it. You think that'll slow him down? I think it makes him less likely to try something dramatic, she said. He's careful. Careful men don't like situations where their moves are being watched officially. She was right about that, up until the morning of the auction, when Victor Ashcombe apparently decided that careful was not the posture that served him best anymore. The Caldwell auction was held on the open ground south of town, the same flat stretch of dry grass that had hosted the annual event for going on 20 years. By 8 in the morning, there were already 36 people milling around. Ranchers, buyers, hands who'd come in with their employers, townspeople who came every year because it was something to see. By 9, the pens were full, and the auctioneer had set up his stand, and the two major buyers connected to Ashcombe's operation had positioned themselves at the far left of the buyer's line with the settled look of men who'd already decided what they were going to pay. The 5 independent buyers were there. Reeves had come early, spoken briefly with Margaret near the documentation table she'd set up at the edge of the field, and left with an expression that said he'd read her letter and absorbed what it said. The others arrived in 1s and 2s over the following hour, each stopping at the table, each leaving with a copy of the state certification and the summary of Webb's letters that Margaret had prepared. Not the letters themselves, which were filed officially now, but a factual summary of what they documented, written in the same direct, undecorated style as everything else she wrote. Garrett moved through the morning feeling the particular tightness of a man who has done everything he can do and now has to wait for other people to do their parts. He talked to the buyers who wanted to talk. He answered questions about the herd. He showed the certification to 3 different people who asked. He did not pace because Margaret had said the previous night, almost in passing, "Don't pace tomorrow. Pacing looks like worry." And he'd filed that away and was honoring it by standing very deliberately still in places instead. Victor arrived at 9:30. He came with 2 men, not Pruitt this time, but men Garrett didn't recognize, better dressed than ranch hands, but not dressed like buyers. The kind of men who show up to provide presents rather than to do anything specific. Victor himself was in his good jacket, and he moved through the crowd with the ease of a man arriving at his own party, shaking hands, exchanging words, performing cordiality for people who would later say they'd seen him there and he'd seemed perfectly normal. He didn't approach Garrett directly. He went around him, the way water goes around a rock, stopping to speak to the 2 major buyers on the left of the line, then moving through the independent buyers with the handshakes and easy smiles of casual socializing. Garrett watched him and kept his face neutral and stayed where he was. It was Coop who noticed. Coop had come to the auction because Garrett hadn't told him not to, and because he was 17 and had helped rebuild this herd with his own hands over the past several weeks and had a personal investment in what happened to it that nobody had asked him about, but that was plainly there in how seriously he'd been taking everything. He'd positioned himself near the independent buyers with the ostensible purpose of answering questions about the cattle, but the actual purpose, it became clear, of watching Victor Ashcombe. He came to Garrett at 9:45 with something specific in his eyes. "He's talking to Pershing," Coop said. Pershing was the young buyer who hadn't committed to the auction but had shown up anyway. I couldn't hear it all, but I heard bloodline and documentation and something about not trusting papers that one party prepared themselves. Garrett said, "All right. You want me to—" "No," Garrett said. "I'll handle it." He walked toward Pershing, not hurrying, and arrived at the conversation between Victor and the young buyer with the timing of a man who happened to be walking past, which he made no attempt to make convincing because there was no point. Victor looked at him. "Garrett." Smooth as always. "Victor." Garrett turned to Pershing. "Mr. Pershing, good to see you here." Pershing looked between them with the expression of a man who's been told 2 different stories about the same thing and is trying to figure out which one to believe. "Mr. Ashcombe was just—" "I heard what Mr. Ashcombe was saying," Garrett said. Not loud, not heated, just factual. "If you have concerns about the documentation, there's a state board certification on the table over there, prepared by a man named Harold Fitch, who has no connection to me or my ranch beyond the inspection he conducted. You're welcome to contact him directly if you'd like to verify it." He looked at Victor. "Is there something specific in the documentation you'd like to discuss?" Victor smiled. "Just making conversation, Garrett." "Sure," Garrett said. He walked back to where he'd been standing. He didn't look back. 20 minutes later, when Margaret took her place near the documentation table as the auction was preparing to begin, Victor made his move. He walked toward her across the open ground with his 2 men slightly behind him and the crowd around the auction ground busy with its own preparations. And he stopped in front of her documentation table and looked at it, and then looked at her with the expression of a man who has decided that a certain kind of directness is his best remaining option. "I want to give you credit," he said. "You've been more trouble than I expected." Margaret looked up from the file she'd been organizing. "Good morning, Mr. Ashcombe. I'm going to say something to you before this starts, and I want you to hear it plainly." He put both hands on the edge of the table and leaned on them slightly. "A woman your age, with no legal standing on this property, interfering in a business arrangement that's been developing for the better part of 2 years, that's a serious position to be in. I could make the next several months very uncomfortable for you." "You've been trying to do that for 7 weeks, Margaret said. Her voice was the same temperature it always was. "I found it manageable so far." Victor's jaw tightened. "I have buyers in that line who'll follow my lead regardless of your paperwork." "You have 2, she said. "I have 5, and one of your 2 is reconsidering." She closed the file. "I know about the letters, Mr. Ashcombe, the ones you sent to the suppliers, the one to the Hartwell agency." She looked at him steadily. "The county land office has copies." Mr. Webb was quite thorough. The name hit him. She saw it. A quick contraction around the eyes, there and gone in less than a second, but there. "Webb doesn't know what he thinks he knows," Victor said. "That'll be for someone official to determine." She picked up the file and held it against her chest. "But I'd suggest that anything you do here today gets added to what's already in that file, because it will be." Victor straightened. He looked at her for a long moment, the full assessing look of a man recalculating in real time, and then he said very quietly, "A grandmother knows nothing about modern ranching." It was the cruelest thing he could have reached for, and they both knew it. Margaret didn't flinch. She tilted her head slightly, the way she did when she was thinking something through rather than reacting to it. "My grandmother," she said, "ran 400 head through 2 droughts and a cattle price collapse in the 1840s and died with the ranch intact and debt-free." She picked up Harold Fitch's certification from the table and held it up so he could see it clearly. "So in my experience, grandmothers know quite a lot about modern ranching. They just don't get credit for it until someone's forced to look at the results." She walked past him toward the auctioneer's stand, where Reeves and 2 of the other independent buyers were waiting, and Victor Ashcombe stood at the empty documentation table and watched her go. The auction started 12 minutes later. What happened at the Caldwell auction in the following 2 hours was not dramatic in the way that confrontations and stories tend to be dramatic. There was no shouting, no single moment that everyone would later describe as the turning point. What there was, instead, was something quieter and in its way more decisive. The independent buyers bid. They bid on broken pine cattle with the confidence of men who had seen the animals themselves, who had reviewed the documentation, who had read Margaret's summary of what had been done to the herd and what Webb's letters contained, and who had made their own calculations about what they were looking at. Reeves opened the bidding on the first lot at a number that was higher than the room expected, and the 2 Ashcombe-connected buyers countered twice and then went quiet when Halloran came in over them, and the price went up. Garrett stood at the edge of the bidding floor and kept his face still and his hands in his pockets, and beside him, close enough that her shoulder was almost at his arm, Margaret watched the numbers with the focused attention of someone doing arithmetic in their head. The Ashcombe buyers dropped out lot by lot. By the 4th lot, they had stopped bidding entirely, and Victor, standing back from the crowd at a slight remove, was watching with the expression of a man who has seen a door close and is deciding whether to knock. By the time the auctioneer brought down his gavel on the last lot, Broken Pine Ranch had sold its cattle for the highest prices it had seen in 3 years. Garrett stood there with the numbers in his head, not fully believing them yet, turning them over, adding them up again to make sure. And Coop grabbed Rafe's arm, and Rafe shook him off, but he was smiling, and Dex said nothing for almost 30 seconds, which was the longest he'd gone without speaking in 6 weeks. Then Dex said, "Told you 5 was enough." Garrett looked at Margaret. She was writing something in her notebook. "What are you writing, Willis?" he asked. "Next year's breeding plan," she said without looking up. "We're going to need to expand if we want to run numbers worth selling." He laughed. It surprised him. Came out before he'd decided to do it, genuine and unguarded, and Margaret looked up at the sound of it with something in her expression that wasn't quite a smile, but was the thing that lives adjacent to one. Across the auction ground, Victor Ashcombe was walking toward his wagon with his 2 men behind him, and he did not look back, and the crowd around him parted in the way crowds part around someone who has just lost something publicly, and everyone has noticed. Garrett watched him go. Then he looked back at the woman beside him, at the notebook and the pen and the silver hair in the afternoon light, and he thought about everything that had happened in the 9 weeks since the stagecoach rolled into Caldwell. The soil tests and the breeding records, and the late nights at the kitchen table and the morning coffee already made, and the way she'd walked away from Victor's money on the platform without a backward glance. And he felt the weight of the past 2 years lift off his chest by some significant portion. Not all of it, not yet, but enough. "Thank you," he said. Margaret capped her pen. "The work isn't done yet," she said. "I know. There's the debt to settle, the land office file to follow up on. The South Pasture still has another month before it's fully productive." She tucked the notebook under her arm. "And we need to talk about the breeding program seriously because what we sold today is the floor, not the ceiling." "I know all that," Garrett said. She looked at him. "Then why are you thanking me?" "Because the floor is still standing," he said, "and 7 weeks ago it wasn't." Margaret looked at the auction ground, at the empty pens, at the buyers still settling their accounts at the table, at the dust settling in the afternoon air over a sale that had gone differently than one man had planned, and exactly as it needed to go. "The floor was always standing," she said quietly. "It just needed someone to clear the debris off it." She walked toward the table to collect the documentation file, and Garrett followed, and behind them the auction ground emptied in the slow, unhurried way of a place where the main event is over, and what comes next is just the ordinary work of a day. The debt settled in stages, the way debt always does when you're paying it back honestly instead of running from it. The first payment went to the bank the Monday after the auction. Garrett drove into Caldwell alone, which he'd insisted on, and came back 2 hours later looking like a man who had just set down something very heavy that he'd been carrying for a long time. He didn't say much about it when he got back. He unsaddled his horse, came into the kitchen where Margaret was working on the expanded breeding projections she'd started at the auction ground, poured himself coffee, and sat down. "How much left?" she asked, without looking up. 2 more payments," he said. "Spring and fall next year, if the projections hold." She nodded and kept writing. "The bank manager asked about you," he added. She looked up then. "Wanted to know if you were staying on," Garrett said. He was looking at his coffee cup. "I told him that was between us." Margaret looked at him for a moment, then she looked back at her notebook. "What did you tell him after that?" "I told him I hoped so." She didn't respond to that directly. She wrote something in the notebook and turned a page, and the kitchen was quiet except for the scratch of the pen and the wind outside doing what Wyoming wind does, which is push against everything without distinguishing between what deserves it and what doesn't. But her pen had slowed slightly, and Garrett, who had gotten better at reading the small signals she gave, noticed. He didn't push it. He drank his coffee and let the morning be what it was. Petit. The investigation into Victor Ashcombe moved at the speed of official things, which is to say, slowly, and with many procedural steps that nobody explained thoroughly to the people most affected by them. What Garrett knew, from the county land office, and from a brief conversation with the territory's livestock commission representative who came through Caldwell in the 3rd week after the auction, was that the file was open, the letters were being reviewed, and Callum Webb had given a formal statement. What the investigation meant in practice, for the immediate present, was less clear. Victor was still on his property. He was still at 4,000 acres. He was visibly quieter than he'd been, and Pruitt had not appeared at Broken Pines Gate since before the auction. But quieter was not the same as gone, and Margaret was careful not to let the relative calm after the auction translate into lowering their guard. "He'll try to interfere with the investigation," she said one evening, about 2 weeks after the auction, when Garrett mentioned that he hadn't heard anything new from the land office. "You think he has people there?" I think he's been operating in this county for 20 years and has relationships everywhere, she said. I'm not saying the investigation will fail. I'm saying it'll take longer than it should, and some of what he did will get lost in the process. She looked across the table at him. That's how it works with men who have money and connections. The consequences come, but they come partial and late. Garrett sat with that. It was true, and he knew it was true. And there was something genuinely frustrating about the gap between what justice was supposed to look like and what it actually looked like in practice. Does that bother you? He asked. That he might not face the full of it? Margaret considered the question seriously, which was the only way she considered questions. What bothers me more is the ranchers he's done this to before us who didn't have Webb's letters and didn't have the documentation and lost everything without anyone opening a file. She picked up her pen. At least the file is open now. At least Webb's statement is on record. That's something, even if it's not everything. It was not the answer that made him feel better, but it was the honest one, and he'd learned by now to prefer her honest answers over the comfortable kind. What changed the investigation's momentum wasn't anything Garrett or Margaret did. It was the neighbors. Aldous, the rancher to the east who'd warned them about the buyer interference, came to Broken Pine 3 weeks after the auction with his hat in his hand and a look of determined discomfort that Garrett recognized as a man preparing to say something difficult. He sat at the kitchen table, which was where most important conversations at Broken Pine happened now, which said something about how the ranch had reorganized itself around that room and the woman who worked in it, and he told them that he had his own history with Victor Ashcombe. A water rights dispute 3 years ago that he'd settled for less than it was worth because Victor had made the legal costs too high to sustain. He'd been paying for that settlement ever since in the form of reduced access to the East Creek during the dry months. I didn't fight it then, Aldous said, because I didn't have anything to fight with. He looked at Margaret. But I heard about Webb's letters, and I've got my own paperwork from that water rights business that I never threw away. He spread his hands on the table. I want to add it to the file. Margaret said, Do you have a lawyer? Can't afford one. You don't necessarily need one to submit documentation to the land office, she said. What you need is an organized account of the timeline, the correspondence you have, and a clear statement of what you're claiming. I can help you put that together if you want. Aldous looked at Garrett. Garrett nodded once. All right, Aldous said. He wasn't the only one. Over the following 2 weeks, 3 more neighboring ranchers came to Broken Pine with variations of the same story: pressured sales, manipulated water access, interference with contracts, all of it traceable back to Victor Ashcombe's operation over the past decade. Each of them had stayed quiet because they thought they were alone in it. Each of them had, in the drawer or the box or the old correspondence file, paperwork they'd never thrown away because it had felt too wrong to destroy, even when they couldn't see what use it would be. Margaret helped all of them. She sat at the kitchen table with each one, sometimes in the evening after the ranch day was done, sometimes on a Sunday when the regular work was slower, and organized their accounts and their documentation into the kind of coherent, dated, clearly presented files that an official body could actually use. She didn't overstate anything. She didn't add color to anyone's story or suggest that what they had was more than it was. She just organized what existed into the shape that made it legible to people who needed to read it. Garrett watched this happen across several evenings with a growing awareness of something he didn't immediately have words for. It wasn't just that she was helping the neighbors. It was the way they looked at her when they left. Aldous, the man with the water rights dispute, a young rancher named Purcell who'd been pressured into selling 40 acres he hadn't wanted to sell. They left differently than they'd arrived. Not fixed. None of the situations were fixed yet, but with the particular steadiness of people who have been taken seriously and given tools and no longer feel entirely alone in something they've been carrying quietly. One evening after Purcell left, Garrett said, You could charge for this. Margaret was organizing Purcell's copies back into the folder. He can barely make his payments. I know, I just mean what you're doing. It's work. Real work. She tied the folder closed. So is everything else I do here. She set it aside and opened her notebook to the breeding projections. I'm not doing it for payment. I'm doing it because it needs doing. He didn't say anything else about it, but he remembered it. The south pasture came back in the 7th week after the auction. Margaret said it wouldn't be visible until week 6 at the earliest, and at the end of week 5, Dex had walked out there and walked back looking unconvinced and said, "Still looks rough." And Margaret had said, "Come back in a week," with the calm certainty of someone who knows what they're watching for. And Dex had come back in a week and stood at the fence line and not said anything for almost 2 minutes. "You want to say you told me so," Garrett said, standing beside him. "She doesn't do that," Dex said, which was true. It was one of the things about Margaret that Dex had clearly decided, somewhere along the way, he respected. The grass wasn't lush. It wasn't going to be lush, not this year, not after what the drought and the neglect had done to it. But it was standing up. It had the right color in the right places. It was doing what grass does when the conditions are finally close enough to what it needs. It was recovering. The breeding program expansion happened more slowly and with more arguing than most things at Broken Pine, which meant it happened pretty similarly to everything else. Margaret had 3 bulls she wanted to retire from breeding and 2 new lines she wanted to introduce, and she'd been presenting the case for this across several weeks in the methodical way she presented cases for things. Data first, cost-benefit second, long-term projection third. Garrett had resisted. Not because she was wrong, but because introducing new bloodlines was an investment that felt risky when they were still paying down the last of the debt, and he told her that. "I know it feels risky," she said. "It is risky." "Garrett," she turned the breeding record toward him. "Look at what these 3 bulls have produced over the past 4 years. The calf weights, the health records, the rate of deficiency. It's all right there. Continuing with them doesn't feel risky because it's familiar, but familiar and safe aren't the same thing. I know the difference." "Then look at the numbers." He looked at the numbers. He sat there and actually looked at them. Not at the idea of them, or what they implied about admitting she was right, but at the actual figures in the columns, and the numbers said what she'd been saying they said for 3 weeks. "How much for the new bulls?" he asked. She told him. It was more than he'd wanted to hear, but less than he'd feared. "Spring?" he asked. "Spring," she confirmed. "After the second debt payment. We'll have enough." He nodded. She made a note in the breeding record and closed it, and across the table from her, Garrett sat with the feeling of a man who has been right about the wrong things and wrong about the right things enough times now that he's started to recalibrate which of those outcomes he's more afraid of. The town started coming to Margaret 6 weeks after the auction, and it happened so gradually that it was several weeks before Garrett fully registered the pattern. It started with Aldous mentioning to someone at the feed store that the woman at Broken Pine had helped him put together his documentation for the county file, and that she seemed to know what she was about, which led to a rancher's wife stopping Margaret in the street when she and Garrett were in Caldwell for supplies, asking about pasture rotation with the slightly apologetic manner of someone who isn't sure if the question is welcome. Margaret had answered it thoroughly and without any indication that the question was an imposition, and the rancher's wife had walked away with 3 things she hadn't known before. Then a man named Holcomb, who ran sheep northeast of town, and who therefore had almost no social overlap with the cattle community and wouldn't have come to Broken Pine on his own, wrote a letter to Garrett asking if Mrs. Holloway might be willing to look at his breeding records because he'd heard she had a way of seeing problems before they became disasters. Garrett showed Margaret the letter. She read it twice. "What do you want to do?" "I want to know what you want to do," he said. "I'll look at his records," she said. "Tell him to come on a Wednesday." Holcomb came on a Wednesday and left 4 hours later with a reorganized breeding timeline and a supplementation plan and a list of questions to ask his vet. He came back a month after that with a gift, a small wheel of cheese from his wife, and the information that his winter lamb losses were down by 1/3 from the previous year. Margaret accepted this cheese and added the information to her notebook without fanfare, and that was that, except that it wasn't, because Holcomb mentioned it to someone who mentioned it to someone else, and that particular thread kept extending in the way threads do in small communities where information about who can actually help you is valuable. By the time November settled its early cold over the territory, there had been 9 people at Broken Pine who'd come not because of Garrett, but because of Margaret. A few she'd charged modest consulting fees, the ones who could afford it, and who, she said practically, wouldn't value the advice if they got it free. The ones who were struggling got the same attention at no charge, and she tracked neither category in any way that was meant to build anything. She just helped the people who came, and people kept coming. Garrett noticed one evening that she was sometimes up later than usual, working by the lamp after he'd gone to bed, and one night he came back downstairs for water and found her at the kitchen table surrounded not by Broken Pine's records, but by 3 different folders belonging to 3 different people. "You don't sleep enough," he said. "I sleep enough," she said, without looking up. "Margaret," she looked up. "You're allowed to say no to some of them," he said. "You don't have to fix everyone's operation." She looked at him steadily. "I know I don't have to." "Then why?" "Because I spent 40 years watching ranches fail that didn't need to fail," she said. "Small things, most of them. Things that someone with a little more experience in the room could have caught before they became unfixable. I know what that costs." She looked back at the folders. "If I can prevent some of that, I will." He stood in the kitchen doorway in the dark, and he looked at her bent over her work at the table that had become in 9 weeks, something entirely different from what it had been when she arrived and found his records in a box. And he thought about what she'd said on the auction ground. The floor was always standing, it just needed someone to clear the debris off it. And he wondered if she knew she was doing that for the entire county and not just for him. He didn't say it. He got his water and went back upstairs, and Margaret worked for another hour before the lamp went out. The question of what they were to each other had been sitting in the corners of the ranch all autumn, unaddressed, not exactly avoided, but not directly approached either. They were not romantic in the conventional sense. There had been no declaration, no moment designed for it, no conversation explicitly about the category of what existed between them. What there was, instead, was a decade's worth of respect compressed into 12 weeks, and the kind of ease that builds between people who have been through something difficult together and have found that the other person's presence in it was a net improvement. Garrett was 53 years old in his thinking, even though he was 41 by the calendar, meaning he'd been made old by loss and debt, and 2 years of watching something he loved deteriorate, and Margaret was somewhere the opposite, younger in her energy than her 57 years might suggest, because she was the kind of person who doesn't slow down when things get hard but speeds up, which is either the secret to not aging or the reason some people don't make it to old age and nobody can tell from the outside which one applies until later. The conversation happened on a Sunday in late November, of all the possible times and ways it could have happened, because of a broken fence post. Garrett was fixing it, a fence on the north edge of the property that had been on the list for 6 weeks and kept getting displaced by more urgent things. And Margaret had come out not because she needed to, but because she was walking the perimeter inspection she did twice a week, and the north edge was on the route. She'd watched him work for a few minutes, handed him the post driver when he reached for it without him asking, and then sat on the adjacent fence rail in the cold November air with her coat pulled around her. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said. He looked up. In 12 weeks, she had never opened with that. "Go ahead," he said. "When you wrote to the agency." She paused, choosing her words in the careful way she chose things. "What were you actually hoping for? Not what you put in the letter, what you actually hoped." He thought about that. Drove the post. Thought about it some more. "Someone who wouldn't leave," he said finally. "That's the honest answer. My first wife didn't leave by choice, and this ranch—" He stopped. "I've been running it alone for 9 years, and the last 2 years of that, it's been running away from me. I wanted someone to stay, someone who'd be here when things went wrong and wouldn't decide it was too much and go." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "And now?" she asked. He looked at her sitting on the fence rail in her coat with her silver hair and her practical expression and the notebook that was probably already in her pocket, ready to record whatever she observed next. "Now I've got someone who reorganized my breeding records and took on Victor Ashcombe and is up past midnight fixing other people's problems," he said. "And I'm aware that what I hoped for and what I got are 2 different things, and that what I got is considerably better." Margaret looked at the north field. A muscle in her jaw moved the way it did when she was working through something. "I'm not what you originally wanted," she said. "It wasn't a complaint, it was just true." "No," he said. "You're what I needed. I didn't know those were different things until you showed up and showed me." She was quiet for a long time. The wind came across the north field and moved through the fence wire with a low note that wasn't musical but wasn't unpleasant either. "I'm not easy to live with," she said. "I've noticed." She looked at him sharply, and then, for the first time in 12 weeks, genuinely, fully, without reservation, she laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that surprises the person having it, and it transformed her face into something that had always been there underneath the capable, organized, practical exterior that she wore as a kind of working armor. Garrett smiled. He couldn't help it. "I'm also not finished," she said, when the laugh had settled. "I have opinions about the spring breeding program and the South Pasture Plan and the way Coop holds a fence post driver that I haven't fully shared yet." "I suspected as much. And I intend to be here for all of it," she said quietly. The laugh was gone, but something of it remained in her voice. "If that's what you're asking." "It's what I'm asking," he said. She nodded. She pulled out her notebook, he'd known she would, and wrote something brief in it, and he didn't ask what, and she didn't tell him. And they both understood that what had just been established between them didn't need to be written anywhere to be real. He finished the fence post. She walked the rest of the perimeter. They came back to the house separately, arriving within 5 minutes of each other, and Dex was in the yard when they came in and looked at one and then the other with the expression of a man who has noticed something and is deciding whether to say it. He didn't say it. He went back to what he was doing. Coop, who was nearby and had less self-control, said, "What happened?" "Fence posts fixed," Garrett said. Coop looked at Margaret. Margaret looked at Coop. "I'll teach you to drive a post properly next week," she said. "You've been doing it wrong since September." Coop's mouth opened. "I've been doing it wrong," she said pleasantly, "but fixable. Most things are." She went inside. Coop turned to Garrett with an expression of profound offense, and Garrett shrugged with the specific helplessness of a man who has made his peace with being outclassed and is no longer troubled by it. The formal investigation into Victor Ashcombe reached its first conclusion in December, 4 months after the auction. It was not the sweeping accountability that the full picture of Webb's letters might have suggested was coming. It was narrower than that. A finding of improper conduct in 3 specific instances of buyer interference, a requirement to pay damages to 2 of the ranchers who'd contributed to the county file, and a formal censure from the Livestock Commission that was, in practical terms, a significant blow to his standing with the major buyers and trade organizations he'd spent 20 years cultivating. Garrett heard about it from the county land office by mail. He read the letter twice at the kitchen table and then slid it across to Margaret, who read it once and set it down. "Not everything," she said. "No. But something." She picked up her coffee. "The damages go to Aldous and Purcell?" "Yes." "Good." She looked out the window at the yard, at the ranch in its December quiet. "The censure matters more than people think. The buyers he controlled, they'll recalibrate their relationship with him. That affects his operation significantly, even if it doesn't look dramatic from the outside." "You think it's enough?" She considered it honestly. "I think it's what was possible in the time and the context." She looked at him. "He still has his land. He'll still be a neighbor, but he's a neighbor who now has an official record, who's lost the trust of his buyers, who knows that 4 ranches in this county have organized their documentation and are watching." She shrugged slightly. "That's a different position than he was in a year ago." Garrett nodded. He'd made his peace with partial the way you make peace with most things. Not enthusiastically, but honestly. What he hadn't made peace with was the remaining question about Broken Pine itself. The 2 debt payments due in the coming year. The South Pasture still rebuilding. The new bulls for spring that he'd agreed to and was now looking at the numbers for with a combination of anticipation and the low-grade anxiety of a man who has been close to the edge and doesn't entirely trust the ground beneath him yet. He told Margaret this late one evening in the kitchen. She listened. She didn't rush to reassure him, which he'd learned to appreciate because false reassurance from her would have meant something was wrong. "You're not going to lose this ranch," she said when he'd finished. "You don't know that." "I know the numbers," she said, "and I know what's been built here in the last 4 months. The breeding program is sound. The pasture is recovering. The buyers we cultivated for the auction, Reeves, Halloran, the others, they'll be back next year and they'll bring others. Reputation compounds, same as debt. She folded her hands on the table. "You're not going to lose this ranch." He looked at her. At the certainty in her that wasn't wishful, wasn't the kind of certainty that comes from wanting something to be true, but the kind that comes from having looked at every number and every variable and arrived at a conclusion. "All right," he said. "All right," she agreed. Outside, the December wind moved across Broken Pine Ranch, across the south pasture coming back, across the pens where the cattle that had come through the auction season stood in their winter quiet, across the barn where Dex had left the light on again like he always did, and someone would have to go back and turn it off. The gate at the entrance creaked once in the wind and then went still. Garrett got up and put his cup in the basin, and Margaret turned back to the breeding projections, and the ranch went on around them the way ranches do. Not dramatically, not in a way that announces itself, but forward, consistently, with the accumulated weight of all the work that had been done pressing behind it. There was still the spring to get through. Still the second year to build. Still 20 things on the list that hadn't been crossed off yet, and 20 more that would appear before the first 20 were done. But the floor was holding. The spring came late that year, the way it sometimes does in Wyoming, grudgingly, like something that had been convinced it was needed but wasn't entirely happy about showing up. The snow held through the first week of March and then released all at once in a melt that turned the ranch roads to mud and kept everyone working twice as hard for half the progress. The south pasture, which had spent the winter quietly doing what amended soil does when left alone, rebuilding, restoring, working its chemistry back towards something viable, emerged from the snow looking better than it had looked in 3 years. Margaret was out there the morning it became clear, standing at the edge of it in her coat with her boots already muddy to the ankle, and she spent a long time looking at it without writing anything in her notebook, which meant she was simply seeing it, just letting it be what it was without recording it. Garrett found her there when he came back from checking the creek levels. "Well," he said. "It'll hold," she said. "Full rotation this year. No need to rest any portion." He looked at the pasture, at the grass coming up green through the last patches of snow at the edges, stubborn and small and entirely alive. He'd been afraid to look at it too closely all winter, the way you avoid looking directly at things you're afraid have failed. It hadn't failed. "You knew it would," he said. "I thought it would," she said, with the precision she always applied to the difference between certainty and informed expectation. "Knowing would have required seeing it. Now I've seen it." She turned back toward the house, and he fell into step beside her, and they walked across the muddy yard together without talking, which had become its own kind of language between them. Bien. The two bulls arrived from a breeder in Montana in the second week of April, delivered by a man who was clearly skeptical of the idea that a ranch running this size needed these particular animals, and who made the mistake of saying so to Dex while unloading. And Dex, who by spring had transformed into something approaching Margaret's most committed advocate, a conversion that had been invisible while it was happening and total when it was complete, told the delivery man in very plain language that the breeding decisions at Broken Pine Ranch were made by someone who knew considerably more about cattle genetics than either of them, and the man should unload the bulls and get back in his wagon. Rafe watched this from the barn doorway with the quiet satisfaction of someone seeing something correct happen. The bulls were good animals. Margaret had selected them from the breeder's records without seeing them in person, through correspondence that had gone on over the winter, letters back and forth about lineage and weight gain ratios and calf health histories, the kind of specific technical exchange that the breeder had initially conducted with the reserve he extended to unknown quantities, and had ended with the respect he gave to people who clearly knew what they were asking about. When the animals arrived, Margaret walked around each one slowly, checked what she needed to check, and said, "They'll do." Coming from her, Coop told Dex later, that was practically a standing ovation. The spring calving season was the first real measure of what the winter's breeding adjustments had produced, and it was not without its problems. 2 difficult deliveries. 1 calf that didn't make it despite everything. 1 cow that needed attention. Margaret and Rafe took turns providing through 2 nights that were colder than late April had any right to be. But the overall picture that emerged from the season was undeniably different from the previous years. The calves were heavier at birth. The losses were down. The animals that came through looked like they came from a herd that had been managed with intention rather than endured. After the last calf of the season was on its feet, Margaret sat on a hay bale in the barn at 6 in the morning with mud on her coat and tiredness around her eyes that she wasn't trying to hide. And Garrett brought her coffee without being asked because he'd learned, across 6 months of living and working on the same property with this woman, the precise circumstances under which she would accept help without arguing about whether she needed it. She took the coffee. "Better year," he said. "Better year," she agreed. "Numbers?" "I'll have the full tally by end of week, but we're looking at roughly 30% fewer losses than last year, and the average birth weight is up." She held the coffee in both hands. "The bulls will show more in next year's crop. This year is still partly the old program. So next year is better again. If we manage it right," she said, "which we will." She said it without bravado, just as fact. Garrett sat down on the adjacent hay bale in the early morning quiet of the barn and drank his own coffee. And outside, the Wyoming spring was doing what it does when it finally commits, fully, without reservation, the cold giving way all at once to something with real warmth in it. And inside the barn, the new calves and their mothers moved in their stalls with the particular piece of animals that have come through something and don't know it. Debt. The second debt payment cleared in the fall, 14 months after the auction. Garrett didn't drive to the bank alone this time. Margaret was with him, not because she'd insisted, but because he'd asked her to come, and she'd said yes without making anything of it. They settled the account with the bank manager, a man named Creel, who had the look of someone perpetually braced for bad news and was visibly disarmed by the absence of it. And on the way back, Garrett stopped the wagon at the rise east of town, where on a clear day you could see the line of the ranch's eastern fence from the road. He stopped there and looked at it for a minute. "Last time I drove this road," he said, "after the first payment, I felt like I'd put down something heavy." "And now?" Margaret asked. "Now it feels like I picked something up instead." He looked at her. "I'm not sure I know how to explain the difference." "You don't have to," she said. He started the horse again and they drove back to the ranch, and the fence line disappeared behind the rise, and the debt was gone, and Broken Pine Ranch belonged entirely to itself for the first time in 3 years. It was around that time, the autumn after the debt cleared, that the town of Caldwell began its own quiet recalibration. The way communities recalibrate when the story they've been telling about someone turns out to be wrong in a way they can't easily excuse. It didn't happen all at once. It happened the way most corrections happen in small places, sideways, without announcement, through a series of small individual decisions that collectively amounted to an acknowledgement nobody was willing to make directly. The rancher's wife, who'd stopped Margaret on the street to ask about pasture rotation, started sending other women to ask questions. A man who'd laughed on the platform the day the stagecoach arrived came to Broken Pine with his hat in his hand and a mineral deficiency problem in his herd that he'd been ignoring for a season, and he addressed Margaret as Mrs. Holloway with the slightly over-careful courtesy of someone compensating for a previous behavior they'd rather not name. Margaret answered his questions the same way she answered everyone's. She did not say she told them so. She did not reference what had happened on the platform. She simply looked at what he brought her and told him what she saw and what she thought could be done about it. And when he left, he knew things he hadn't known before, and she went back to what she'd been doing, and that was the extent of it. Garrett noticed, though. "You're not going to make them say it," he said one evening. "Say what?" "That they were wrong. About you. When you arrived." She looked up from the breeding projections. "What would be the point?" "The point would be that you earned it." "I didn't do any of this to make them say something," she said. "I did it because the work needed doing." She turned a page. "If they've learned something from watching, that's worth more than an apology anyway." He let it go. But he thought about it for several days after, because there was something in it that he kept turning over, the idea that some people are so focused on the work itself that they genuinely don't need the acknowledgement that other people spend their lives chasing. He'd spent 20 years knowing men who needed credit for everything they did, who measured their worth in how loudly it was recognized. And there was something in Margaret's complete indifference to that, not performed indifference, actual indifference, that said something important about where her sense of herself came from. It didn't come from other people. It never had. The legal matter around Victor Ashcombe concluded its official process in the spring of the second year with a result that was, as Margaret had predicted, partial. He paid the damages. He accepted the censure. He retained his land and his operation, though both were diminished. Two of his major buyer relationships had quietly ended, and two of the ranchers whose documentation had contributed to the county file had renegotiated the agreements that Victor had pressured them into years earlier. Callum Webb, who had given his statement and provided his letters and set the whole formal process in motion, had started his own small operation by then with the wages Victor eventually paid under order, 120 acres north of Caldwell, that were nothing much to start with, but that Webb, who turned out to share a certain quality of determined attention with Margaret, was working into something. He came to Broken Pine once in that second spring, ostensibly to ask about selenium testing, and sat at the kitchen table the way everyone eventually sat at the kitchen table. And afterward he said to Garrett on his way out, "You know what I think the strangest part of all this is?" Garrett said he didn't. "He was trying to control who came here," Webb said. "He went to all that trouble to make sure you got someone who couldn't help you. And the one person who could help you more than anyone he could have imagined. She just showed up anyway." He shook his head. He beat himself, in a way. Made his own plan fail by making it too specific. Garrett thought about that for a long time after Webb left. He thought about the word unsuitable and what Victor had meant by it, and how spectacularly the calculation had gone wrong. Not because the agency had defied him exactly, but because the quality he'd been trying to filter out, genuine competence, real experience, the kind of knowledge that only comes from decades of actual work, was not something you could reliably exclude by specifying age or appearance or conventional desirability. He'd been so certain he knew what an unsuitable woman looked like that he hadn't considered what a genuinely capable one might look like when she stepped off a stagecoach. He'd looked at Margaret Holloway and seen an old woman. He'd been looking at the wrong thing entirely. The gate sign was Margaret's idea, and it was also the only time in 2 years that Garrett saw her be, briefly, uncertain. She brought it up on a November evening, the 2nd November, the one after the debt was gone and the calves had been good, and the south pasture had run full rotation without issue, and Broken Pine Ranch had the particular solidity of a place that has been through the worst and has come out the other side with its structure intact. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I want you to answer honestly, not kindly." He looked up from the feed cost projections they'd been reviewing. "All right." "The gate sign," she said. "It says Boone. It said Boone for how long?" "My grandfather put it up," Garrett said. "So close to 40 years. She nodded. She was looking at the table rather than at him. "I've been thinking about whether to say this, and I've decided I'd rather say it and hear no than not say it." She looked up. "I think it should say Boone and Holloway." He was quiet. "Not for me," she said quickly, and he could hear in it the particular tone she used when she was being careful about something. "I mean, partly for me, I won't pretend otherwise, but also because—" She stopped. Started again. "This ranch is different than it was. What it's becoming isn't just what your grandfather built and what you've maintained. It's something new, and I've been part of building that new thing, and I think—" She exhaled. "I think what you name something says something about what you believe built it." Garrett looked at her across the kitchen table in the lamplight, at this woman who had reorganized his breeding records and fixed his pasture, and stood in front of Victor Ashcombe with a certification in her hand and not flinched, who had helped 6 neighbors file documentation and taught Coop to drive a fence post and made coffee every morning before anyone else was awake, who had told him honestly and without sentimentality every hard thing he'd needed to hear in 2 years and had been right about nearly all of it. "I was going to ask you the same thing," he said. She blinked. "You were." "I just didn't know how to start the conversation." She looked at him for a moment with the expression she had when she was checking whether something was true or merely kind, and she must have found it true because she nodded slowly and something in her shoulders released slightly, the particular release of someone who has been carrying a question they didn't know they were carrying. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. The sign went up on a Saturday in late November, installed by Dex and Rafe while Coop held the post level and gave unsolicited opinions about the angle. It was a simple sign, good wood, clean letters, nothing decorative. It said Broken Pine Ranch, and beneath the name, in letters the same size, Boone and Holloway. Coop stood back and looked at it when it was done. "Looks right," he said. Dex made a sound that wasn't agreement or disagreement. Rafe said nothing, but he looked at it for a few seconds longer than the job required. The way he looked at things he thought were worth looking at. Margaret and Garrett were at the fence line when they put it up, close enough to see but not standing over it the way people stand over things they're anxious about. They watched from a distance. When it was done, Margaret looked at it for a long moment, at her name in the Wyoming air beside his, on the gate of a ranch she'd arrived at as a stranger and had worked into something that had her hands all through it. She didn't say anything, but Garrett was watching her face, and what he saw there was not triumph. It wasn't the expression of someone who had won something. It was quieter than that. It was the expression of someone who had worked very hard at something real and was finally, in this one small visible way, being told that the work had been seen. He understood that. He'd spent 9 years working at something real and feeling like nobody was seeing it. "Thank you," he said. She looked at him. "I thought I was supposed to be the one thanking you." "No," he said. "You came here to a situation that wasn't what you expected, and you stayed anyway, and you built something. That deserves saying." She looked back at the sign. "We built something," she said. He didn't argue with that. The years have a way of compressing once the urgency is gone. The third year at Broken Pine went quietly in the way that good years go quietly. Not without difficulty, because ranching doesn't have years without difficulty, but without the particular knife-edge quality of the years before it, the feeling of something always about to give. The new breeding program produced what Margaret had projected it would produce. The South Pasture ran full capacity. Reeves and Halloran became reliable annual buyers, and through them came 2 new buyers from the north that Reeves had apparently talked to about what he'd seen at Broken Pine's private preview, and what those buyers saw in the third year convinced them to come back in the fourth. Reputation compounds, Margaret had said. Same as debt, just in the other direction. She was right about that too. By the fourth year, the operation had grown past what 3 hands could manage efficiently, and they hired 2 more. A married couple from Kansas who'd come west looking for steady work, the wife turning out to have a facility with the cattle records that Coop, who had grown from 17 to 21 and was now doing real work rather than earnest work, had the good grace to admire instead of resent. Coop himself had changed in ways that were visible to anyone who'd known him at the beginning. He still talked too much, and still had opinions about things he hadn't earned opinions on yet. But he developed, under Margaret's patient and occasionally blunt instruction, a genuine ability to read land and animals, to notice things before they became problems, to watch instead of just looking. He would tell people later, in the way young people sometimes acknowledge the things that shaped them, that the most useful thing anyone had ever taught him was the difference between those 2 words, watching and looking. You could look at something every day for years and see nothing. Watching required you to be present in a different way. Margaret never described it that way to him. She just kept sending him back out to the pasture and asking him what he'd seen, and eventually he started seeing things. The moment that got written into the permanent record of what Broken Pine Ranch became. The moment that people in Caldwell and the surrounding county still mentioned years later when they talked about the place, happened on a warm afternoon in the 5th year, at the county agricultural meeting held in the Caldwell Community Hall. It was a routine meeting mostly, the kind that happens twice a year and covers grazing schedules and water rights, and the practical logistics of a community of ranchers sharing a territory. Margaret had been attending since the 2nd year, initially as Garrett's partner and gradually as someone people addressed directly with questions, which had shifted by the 4th year into her being the person who kept the meeting on track when it wandered, which it always did. The meeting that afternoon had gotten into a prolonged disagreement about grazing rotation along the shared eastern boundary, a disagreement that had been developing for 2 seasons and that had the quality of something personal underneath the practical dispute. 2 ranchers had been talking past each other for 20 minutes, and the room had the restless energy of people who wanted resolution but didn't see how to get there. Margaret had been quiet through most of it, listening, taking occasional notes. Then she said, "Can I say something?" The room went quiet. She laid out the situation in about 4 minutes. Not diplomatically, not in the way of someone trying to avoid offense, but accurately. She described what each rancher's actual usage had been over the past 2 seasons, which she had apparently been tracking for her own reference. She pointed out where the real conflict was, which was not where either of the ranchers thought it was. She suggested a rotation adjustment that addressed both their concerns and asked each man directly if he could live with it. Both men said yes. The meeting moved on. Afterward, in the yard outside the hall, a rancher named Bickle, who'd been attending these meetings since before Garrett was born, stood next to Garrett and said, "That woman is going to end up running this county if someone's not careful." Garrett said, "I suspect she could run it without anyone noticing until it was already running better." Bickle laughed. Then he looked at Garrett with the kind of directness that old men sometimes allow themselves. "She's something rare," he said. "You know that." "I do," Garrett said. "Most men your age would have sent her back on the first day." Bickle said it without judgment, just observation. Because of how it looked, not what it was, just how it looked. Garrett thought about the platform, about Victor holding out the money, about the moment he'd put his hat on and said, "Don't come to my property," and walked after a woman he'd known for 30 minutes, because something about the way she'd picked up her bag felt like the right direction to walk. "I almost did," he said honestly. Bickle nodded. "Difference between what you almost do and what you actually do," he said. "That's where everything lives." There's a thing that happens to people who've spent their lives being underestimated. One of two things, usually. Either they spend their energy fighting it, proving themselves against every new version of the same dismissal, exhausting themselves in the effort of making people see what they refuse to see, or they stop fighting it and simply do the work, and let the work accumulate into something undeniable, and let other people's slow recognition come at whatever speed it comes. Margaret Holloway had chosen the second path a long time before she stepped off a stagecoach in Caldwell, Wyoming. Not because she was patient by nature, she wasn't particularly, not in the conventional sense, but because she'd learned early that the fight against being underestimated costs exactly the energy you need for the work, and the work is the only thing that actually changes anything. The town had called her worthless on the day she arrived. They'd meant it in the way people mean things when they're performing for each other, not as a measured assessment, but as a shorthand, a quick social calculation that said she didn't fit the category of valuable that they recognized. What they'd missed, and what took them varying amounts of time to figure out, was that the category they recognized was too small. Worth isn't the same thing as market value. Worth isn't what someone will pay at auction, or what the agency suggests, or what the rancher ordered. Worth is what you can actually do, what you actually know, what you actually build with your hands and your mind over the course of a life. You can't read it off a person on a platform in 30 seconds. You can't assess it by age or appearance, or whether they match the image in your head of what help is supposed to look like. Victor Ashcombe had understood this instinctively, which was why he'd tried so hard to prevent Margaret from arriving with any real capability. He'd known, before Garrett did, before the town did, that experience was the one thing money couldn't simply outlast. You could delay it, obstruct it, spread rumors about it, but you couldn't make it not true. And she had 40 years of it. 6 years after the stagecoach arrived in Caldwell, Broken Pine Ranch was running 500 head on fully recovered pasture under a breeding program that had produced 3 consecutive years of above-average calf weights and almost no preventable losses. The operation employed 7 people full-time and had standing contracts with 4 buyers, including Reeves, who had at some point gone from independent buyer to something closer to a business partner in the informal way that things become formal in frontier economies. The debt was gone, had been gone for 4 years. The south pasture, which Margaret had identified as the first and most critical problem on the day she'd pulled out her notebook and the buckboard, was the most productive section of the ranch. Callum Webb's operation to the north was growing. Aldous had renegotiated his water rights through the county process and recovered access to the East Creek at levels that made his operation viable again. Purcell had gotten his 40 acres back through a separate proceeding that the county file had made possible. Victor Ashcombe was still on his 4,000 acres. He would probably always be on his 4,000 acres, but his operation was quieter than it had been, his influence in the county considerably reduced, and the 2 major buyers who'd followed his lead at the auction had not returned to following it since. He was a diminished presence, which in some ways was a more lasting consequence than a dramatic one. Drama resolves, but diminishment is something you live with every day. The gate sign still said Boone and Holloway. People in Caldwell had stopped noticing it as anything remarkable, which meant it had achieved what all real things eventually achieve. It had become simply true, simply part of how the place was known, the way a thing stops being notable and starts being real. On an evening in the 5th year, sitting at the kitchen table, the same table where the records had first been spread out, where Webb's letters had been read, where Aldous and Purcell and Holcomb and all the others had sat with their problems, Margaret was going through the breeding projections for the following season, and Garrett was reading the market reports, and outside the Wyoming dark had come down over Broken Pine the way it always did, complete and uncompromising. Garrett set down the market report. "I want to tell you something," he said. She looked up. 9 years, he said. "Before you came, I was running this place for 9 years after my wife died, and I was working harder every year and getting less for it every year, and I couldn't figure out whether the problem was the ranch or me." He paused. "Turns out the answer was neither. The problem was I was working alone." Margaret looked at him across the table. "I'm not saying I couldn't have figured some of it out eventually," he said. "I'm saying I was going the wrong direction, and the difference between someone who corrects you and someone who doesn't isn't just about that one wrong direction. It's about every wrong direction you'd have kept going before you found your own way back." He picked up the market report again. "I just wanted to say that." Margaret was quiet for a moment. She looked at her notebook. She looked at the lamp. She looked at the table that had been the center of gravity of this ranch for 6 years now. This ordinary piece of furniture that had carried everything. "I wasn't going anywhere either," she said quietly. "Before I came here, I had the ranch in Colorado, but it wasn't mine anymore, and I was—" She stopped. "I was very capable, and very useful, and very alone. I was making good decisions in an empty house." She picked up her pen. So, Garrett said. She wrote something in the notebook. He read the market report. The lamp burned between them, and the ranch went on outside in its ordinary winter quiet, and there was nothing dramatic about any of it. No moment designed for recognition, no scene built for significance. Just two people at a table in the dark, doing the work, present for each other the way that matters most, which is consistently and without performance, year after year, in the plain ongoing fact of showing up. Some people spend their whole lives waiting to be seen. Margaret Holloway had stopped waiting a long time ago. She'd decided, somewhere in her 40s, that the energy required to wait for recognition was better spent building something so plainly real that recognition eventually had no choice but to arrive. She'd been right about that too. The name on the gate said so. The recovered pasture said so. The breeding records said so. The 500 cattle that would go to auction in the spring and sell for prices nobody in this county would have predicted 6 years ago. Said so in the clearest language available, the language of results, which is the only language that was ever worth speaking. The woman they'd called worthless had built something worth more than anything they'd imagined possible. Not because she'd set out to prove them wrong, because she'd set out to do the work. And she had.